Early this week, after months of apparently futile trade negotiations, Donald Trump sent a letter to the EU announcing that if the EU wanted to, quote, participate in the extraordinary economy of the United States, the number one market in the world by far, EU exporters would have to pay a tariff of only 30%. This has dramatically undermined the Commission's strategy of appeasement and left the EU scrambling to respond. So in this video, we thought we'd take a look at why the US-EU trade negotiations are going so badly and what might happen next. Could you rank every single politician in the world? Hear our thoughts and argue with us on our podcast, the World Leader Leaderboard. Find it on the TLDR Podcast YouTube channel or in your favorite podcast app. So let's start by explaining why Trump is even starting this trade war. Trump's main issue seems to be that the EU runs a trade surplus with the US. In other words, the EU sells more stuff to the US than it buys. For context, the EU runs a roughly $200 billion surplus in goods to the US. In other words, the EU sells $200 billion more to the US than it buys from the States. Although we should mention here that this is mostly offset by the roughly $150 billion deficit that the EU runs in services to the US. While Trump's focus on bilateral trade data is probably misplaced, he nonetheless has somewhat of a point here. The EU has run persistent overall trade surpluses since really the 2010s, and it will probably be a good thing for both the European and global economies if the EU's trade was a bit more balanced. And if Trump was exclusively worried about this trade imbalance, then a deal would probably be doable. After all, the EU negotiated such a deal with Trump back in 2018, which basically involved the EU committing to buy more American LNG and soybeans. Now, this didn't really make much of a difference to the overall trade balance, but the idea of Europe buying more American stuff kept Trump happy, and it was a pretty minimal concession from the EU's perspective. However, this time round, Trump and his team have both threatened bigger tariffs than they did last time round, and also folded in a whole load of other issues into the negotiation. For instance, Trump has complained on multiple occasions about European value-added tax or VAT regimes, which he seems to think advantage domestic European companies. Vice President J.D. Vance has also complained about European free speech laws and cordon sanitaires against far-right parties on the continent, while Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent has complained about Europe's digital service taxes, especially the ones in France and Italy. This has made recent negotiations far more difficult, not only because most European countries consider these issues to be domestic policy issues, and thus see Trump's griping as an unacceptable form of foreign interference, but also because they see Trump's complaints as baseless. On VAT, for instance, Trump seems to think that VATs discriminate against American companies, but this simply isn't true. European VAT regimes are applied equally to imports and domestic goods produced in the EU. Similarly, while it's true that digital service taxes generally most affect American companies, that's not because there's some clause in them that says this tax only applies to American companies. It's just because America happens to have the biggest tech companies. Europe's digital service taxes aren't a jealous reaction to America's dominance in tech either. On the contrary, Europe would love to have its own big tech companies they could tax. Rather, they're a reaction to the fact that these tech companies find it particularly easy to avoid paying tax in Europe. And obviously, Europe sees America's absolutist free speech laws as one of the reasons that American politics is as dysfunctional as it is, rather than some liberal idea that Europe wants to aspire to. Furthermore, while it might be true that Europe runs persistent trade surpluses, the EU is still one of the most open economies in the world, with some of the lowest tariff barriers, and it's not obvious what more it can do to facilitate trade. Nonetheless, despite all of this, in the recent negotiations, the EU has taken a remarkably conciliatory stance. The EU has refrained from imposing retaliatory tariffs, and the retaliatory tariffs that the EU has prepared are pretty trivial, applying to just 21 billion euros of American imports. Not a lot in the context of a 1.6 trillion euro transatlantic trading relationship. The European Commission has also dropped plans to levy an EU-level digital services tax, and has sided with Washington in its criticism of Chinese trade policy. Here, von der Leyen seems to be attempting to emulate Keir Starmer's relatively successful approach to Trump, and the EU is apparently hoping for a UK-style deal, i.e. accepting the 10% flat tariff but avoiding any further tariffs, with quotas for sensitive exports like cars, which is what the UK had, topped off with a couple of purchase agreements. The UK, for instance, agreed to buy more Boeing planes, while Europe might again commit to buying more American LNG or soybeans. The UK also successfully resisted US pressure to scrap its digital tax and VAT regime, and Starmer pushed back quite forcefully against Vance's suggestion that the UK has a free speech problem. And yet, so far, this hasn't really worked for the EU. Trump is apparently unwilling to offer the EU a UK-style deal, maybe because he likes Starmer more than he likes von der Leyen, or maybe because the UK has a more broadly balanced trade with the US. But regardless, Trump is saying that there's nothing the EU can do to avoid this new 30% tariff. All of this suggests that the EU has to stop offering carrots, as Starmer did, and start wielding sticks, as she did. This could mean retaliatory tariffs on American goods, or if that doesn't work, the EU could resort to its new, as of yet unused, anti-coercion instrument, sometimes dubbed the trade bazooka, which provides legal grounds for the EU to respond asymmetrically to economic coercion. This would allow the EU to whack big fines on American tech companies and exclude American firms from government contracts. The EU should also consider cooperation with other countries trying to negotiate trade deals with the US, like Canada, Japan, and South Korea. While the US does have the upper hand in negotiations with individual countries, it will have less leverage over an anti-American trade alliance, and a coordinated retaliation could impose steeper costs on Trump. The EU should also remember that the US just doesn't have as much leverage as it seems. For starters, the EU doesn't rely on US exports anywhere near as much as America's other trading partners. US exports account for just 3% of the EU's GDP, compared to about 20% for Canada. And unlike America's poorer trading partners, the EU has a wealthy and well-developed consumer base that could replace the American market. It's also worth noting that Trump has proven sensitive to market pressures before, and the EU arguably has more fiscal space than the US does to respond to a tariff-induced economic shock, given America's massive deficit and debt burden. In a truly nuclear scenario, European countries could even sell their treasury holdings to exacerbate America's fiscal woes, something that Japan actually floated doing a couple of months ago. More broadly though, it really does feel like we're in a period of political change at the moment. Gone are the days of predictable geopolitics, with Trump's America taking increasingly dramatic turns, so much so that it feels that America's influence, popularity, and dominance are all on the decline. So in the next issue of our magazine, Too Long, we're discussing this shift, and the potential that we're currently observing the end of the American order. In that section of the magazine, we discuss our thoughts on everything from the collapse of democratic norms to if America is losing allies, and if the country can maintain its dominance in energy and tech, before discussing who could potentially take over in a post-American world. So if you want to find out what we really think about America, now's your chance. It's not just the US either though. This issue is our longest ever at 78 pages. So we also get into stories like why El Salvador and Kosovo are becoming the world's penal colonies, if the UK is lacking vision at the moment, if Europe can really defend itself, and why leaders like Putin and Netanyahu seem to be getting away with it. Plus, we also have a full interview with Professor James Kerr-Lindsay, who you might also know from YouTube, all about the collapse of the global order. Now, if that all sounds good to you, but you'd rather listen than read along, then you should check out the premium edition. Because anyone who buys a premium edition of our magazine also gets access to our recordings of selected articles. Plus, you also get access to the full 90-minute interview with James Kerr-Lindsay. On top of that, premium subscribers also get access to our behind-the-scenes podcast, The Bullpen. Regardless of whether you opt for the regular or premium edition, if you never want to miss an issue, then make sure you subscribe to Too Long, which gets you 20% off every copy as long as you stay subscribed. Plus, this week only, if you use the code BESTOFFER when signing up for a subscription, you'll get an additional 35% off. That brings down the cost as low as £5.20, or a wild 48% off. That is the best offer we are ever going to offer. So pre-order your copy today to get yourself that extra content and support all of the journalism we do here at TLDR every single day.